Section 1 of Strange Roads and With the Gods in Spring by Arthur Machen. Section 1. Arthur Machen, a Novelist of Ecstasy and Sin by Vincent Starlett. With singular unanimity, critics for 30 years have slighted the work of Arthur Machen. A line suffices for him in Holbrook Jackson's The 1890s, and Mr. Blakey Murdoch ignores him completely in The Renaissance of the 90s. Yet those are the standard works on the period to which, chronologically at least, Machen belongs. Mr. Turquet-Milne, with greater appreciation, gives him a half-chapter in his scholarly work, The Influence of Baudelaire, but even that is made up largely of quotations from The Hill of Dreams, to prove Machen a descendant of Baudelaire, an error to which I subscribed until Machen himself disillusioned me, although the assertion is still partially true. Because, in my opinion, Arthur Machen is the outstanding artist of his time, and one of the great masters of all time. I wrote the following paper, which first appeared in Reedy's Mirror for October 5th, 1917. That issue is not now obtainable, and as calls for it continue to come to me and to the publisher, I find ground for a belief that Machen may at length be coming into his own, a tardy phenomenon which I am happy to hasten so far as it lies within my power. Mr. Walter M. Hill shares this feeling, and this brochure is the result. I am indebted to Mr. William Marion Reedy for permission to reprint those parts of the article which appeared in his journal. V.S. Arthur Machen. Some 30-odd years ago, a young man of 22, the son of a Welsh clergyman, fresh from school and with his head full of a curiously occult medievalism, privately acquired from yellowed palimpsests and dog-eared volumes of black letter, wrote a classic. More, he had it published. Only one review copy was sent out. That was to Le Livre of Paris. It fell into the hands of Octave Vouzan, who instantly ordered Rabelais and Boccaccio to shove over on the immortal seats and make room by their side for the author. The book was The Chronicle of Clemendy, the author Arthur Machen. 3 years ago, not long after the Great War first shook the world, a London evening newspaper published inconspicuously a purely fictional account of a supposed incident of the British retreat from Mons. It described the miraculous intervention of the English archers of Agincourt at a time when the British were sore pressed by the German hordes. Immediately churchmen, spiritualists, and a host of others seized upon it as an authentic record, and the miracle as an omen. In the hysteria that followed, Arthur Machen, its author, found himself a talked-of man, because he wrote to the papers denying that the narrative was factual. Later, when his little volume, The Bowmen and Other Legends of the War, appeared in print, it met with an extraordinary and rather impertinent success. But what had Machen been doing all those long years between 1885 and 1914? In a day of haphazard fiction and rhodomontade criticism, the advent of a master workman is likely to be unheralded, if indeed he is fortunate enough to find a publisher to put him between covers. Mr. Machen is not a newcomer. However, as we have seen, no immediate success with a bestseller furnishes an incentive for complimentary notice. He is an unknown, in spite of Clemendy, in spite of the Bowmen, in spite of everything. For 30 years he has been writing English prose, a period ample for the making of a dozen reputations of the ordinary kind, and in that time he has produced just 10 books. In 30 years, Harold Bendloss and Rex Beach will have written 110 books and sold the moving picture rights of them all. Of course, it is exactly because he does not write books of the ordinary kind that Arthur Machen's reputation as a writer was not made long ago. His apotheosis will begin after his death. The insexual fame of the popular novelist is immediate. It is born at dawn and dies at sunset. The enduring fame of the artist too often is born at sunset, but it is immortal. More than Hawthorne or Tolstoy, Machen is a novelist of the soul. He writes of a strange borderland lying somewhere between dreams and death, peopled with shades, beings, spirits, ghosts, men, women, souls. What shall we call them? The very notion of whom stops vaguely just short of thought. He writes of the life of Satiric. For him Pan is not dead. His votaries still whirl through woodland windings to the mad pipe that was Syrinx, and carouse fiercely in enchanted forest grottos, hidden somewhere, perhaps, in the 4th dimension. His meddling with the crucibles of science is appalling in its daring, its magnificence, and its horror. Even the greater works of fictional psychology, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, if you like, shrink before his astounding inferences and suggestions. It is his theory that the fearful and shocking rites of Bacchic cultists survive in this disillusioned age, that panic, lechery, and wickedness did not cease with the agony, as Mrs. Browning and others would have us believe. Of Hawthorne, author Symonds wrote, "He is haunted by what is obscure, dangerous, and on the confines of good and evil." Machen crosses those perilous frontiers. He all but lifts the veil, himself indeed passes beyond it. But the curtain drops behind him, and we, hesitating to follow, see only dimly the phantasmagoria beyond, the ecstasies of vague shapes with a shining about them, on the one hand, on the other the writhings of animate gargoyles, and we experience, I think, a distinct sense of gratitude toward this terrible guide for that we are permitted no closer view of the mysteries that seem to him so clear. We glimpse his secrets in transfiguring flashes from afar, as Launcelot viewed the Sangreal, and like the tarnished knight we quest vainly a tangible solution, half in apprehension, always in glamour. But it is like Galahad we must seek the eternal mysteries that obsess Arthur Machen. There is no solution but an absolution, for it is the mysteries of life and death of which he writes, and of life in death and death in life. This with particular reference to Machen's two most important books, The House of Souls and The Hill of Dreams, in which he reaches his greatest stature as a novelist of the soul. There are those who will call him a novelist of sin, quibbling about a definition. With these I have no quarrel. The characterizations are synonymous. His books exhale all evil and all corruption, yet they are as pure as the fabled waters of that crystal spring De Leon sought. They are pervaded by an ever-present, intoxicating sense of sin, ravishingly beautiful, furiously pagan, frantically lovely. But Machen is a finer and truer mystic than the two-penny occultists who guide modern spiritualistic thought. If we are to subscribe to his curious philosophy, to be discussed later, we must believe that there is no paradox in this. But something of what we are getting at is explained in his own pages, in this opening paragraph from his story The White People in the House of Souls. "Sorcery and sanctity," said Ambrose, "these are the only realities. Each is an ecstasy, a withdrawal from the common life." And a little later in this, "There is something profoundly unnatural about sin, the essence of which really is in the taking of heaven by storm." One gathers from a general vagueness on the subject that sin is not popular in these times. There are, of course, new sins, and advanced sins, and higher sins, all of which are intensely interesting. The chief puzzle to the lay mind is why they should bear these names, since they are usually neither new, advanced, and high, nor particularly sinful. I am speaking of sin as an offense against the nature of things, and of evil in the soul, which has very little to do with the sins of the statute book. Sin, according to the same Ambrose I have quoted, is conceivable in the talking of animals. If a chair should walk across a room, that would be sinful, or if a tree sat down with us to afternoon tea. The savage who worships a conjurer is a far finer moralist than the civilized who suspects him. And I use the name moralist for one who has an appreciation of sin. This is not the sin of the legal code. Ambrose I conceive to be Arthur Machen. There are only two realities, sorcery and sanctity, sin and sainthood, and each is an ecstasy. Arthur Machen's is the former. Perhaps his most remarkable story, certainly I think his most terrible story, is the great god Pan, at first published separately with the inmost light now occurring in the House of Souls. It is the story of an experiment upon a girl, as a result of which for a moment she is permitted a sight of the great god beyond the veil, with shocking consequences. Yet it is told with exquisite reticence and grace, and with a plausibility that is as extraordinary as it is immoral. Here is the conclusion of that story. "What I said Mary would see, she saw. But I forgot that no human eyes could look on such a vision with impunity. And I forgot, as I have just said, that when the house of life is thus thrown open, there may enter in that for which we have no name, and human flesh may become the veil of a horror one dare not express." The blackened face, the hideous form upon the bed, changing and melting before your eyes from woman to man, from man to beast, and from beast to worse than beast. All the strange horror that you witnessed surprises me but little. What you say the doctor you sent for saw and shuddered at, I noticed long ago. I knew what I had done the moment the child was born, and when it was 5 years old I surprised it, not once or twice but several times with a playmate. You may guess of what kind. And now Helen is with her companions. There is the very quintessence of horror in the unutterable suggestion of such passages. As for The Hill of Dreams, I have found its reading one of the most desolate and appalling experiences in literature. Reading it himself years after publication, its author decided that it was a depressing book. That is undoubtedly true, but spiritually as well as technically, it marks to date the topmost pinnacle of his tormented genius. It reaches heights so rarefied that breathing literally becomes painful. To the casual reader, this sounds absurd. Hyperbolical if not hypocritical rant. But in a day when a majority of critics find it difficult to restrain themselves in speaking of Harold Bell Wright, and place Geoffrey Farnell beside Fielding and Thackeray, one cannot go far wrong in indulging a few enthusiasms for so genuine an artist as Arthur Machen. Of the reviewers into whose hands fell this remarkable book in the year of its publication, 1907, only one appears to have valued it at its real worth. The editor of the Academy, who, carried away by the tale and its telling, turned out a bit of critical prose which might have been lifted from the book itself. "There is something sinister in the beauty of Mr. Machen's book," he wrote. "It is like some strangely shaped orchid, the color of which is fierce and terrible, and its perfume is haunting to suffocation by reason of its intolerable sweetness. The cruelty of the book is more savage than any of the cruelty which the book describes. Lucian shuddered at the boys who were deliberately hanging an ungainly puppy. He had thrashed the little ruffian who kicked the sick cat, before he wrapped himself away from the contact of such infamy in the shelter of his own imaginings. For in the Hill of Dreams, you seem to be shown a lovely, sensitive boy who has fashioned himself a white palace of beauty in his own mind. He has had time only to realize its full beauty when disease lays its cold touch upon him, and gathers him into her grasp, until he lies decaying and horrible, seeing his own decay, and seeing that his decay makes the white palace foul. The boys did not chant songs as they looped the string round the neck of the uncouth puppy. Mr. Machen fashions prose out of the writhings of Lucian, who is dear to him. And his prose has the rhythmic beat of some dreadful oriental instrument, insistent, monotonous, haunting, and still the soft tone of one careful flute sounds on, and keeps the nerves alive to the slow and growing pain of the rhythmic beat. Lucian, in ecstasy of worship for the young girl whose lips have given him a new life, pressed his body against sharp thorns until the white flesh of his body was red with drops of blood. That, too, is the spirit of the book. It is like some dreadful liturgy of self-inflicted pain set to measured music, and the cadence of that music becomes intolerable by its suave phrasing and perfect modulation. The last long chapter with its reoccurring themes is a masterpiece of prose, and in its way unique. After that, there would seem to be no need for further comment on the Hill of Dreams, but there is. Quite as important as what Mr. Machen says in his manner of saying it. He possesses an English prose style which in its mystical suggestion and beauty is unlike any other I have encountered. There is ecstasy in his pages. Joris Karl Huysmans, in a really good translation, suggests Machen better perhaps than another. Both are debtors to Baudelaire. I have let this last assertion stand as part of the original article, although Mr. Machen writes me that I am in error. I never read a line of Baudelaire, he says, but I have read deeply in Poe, who I believe derives largely from Baudelaire. Of course it is the other way round. Baudelaire derives from Poe, but my own assumption is rendered clear. V.S. The ecstasy one finds in Machen's work, of which more anon, is due in no small degree to his beautiful English style. An abominable word, but Machen is no mere word juggler. His vocabulary, while astonishing and extensive, is not affectedly so. yet his sentences move to sonorous, half-submerged rhythms, swooning with pagan color and redolent of sacerdotal incense. What is the secret of this graceful English method? It is this. He achieves his striking results and effects through his noteworthy gift of selection and arrangement. I had reached this conclusion, I think, before I encountered a passage from the Hill of Dreams, which clinched it. Language, he understood, was chiefly important for the beauty of its sounds, by its possession of words resonant, glorious to the ear, by its capacity, when exquisitely arranged, of suggesting wonderful and indefinable impressions, perhaps more ravishing and further removed from the domain of strict thought than the impressions excited by music itself. Here lay hidden the secret of suggestion, the art of causing sensation by the use of words. Was it ever better expressed? He defines his method and exhibits its results at the same time. And dipping almost at random into the same volume, here is a further example of the method. Slowly and timidly he began to untie his boots, fumbling with the laces, and glancing all the while on every side at the ugly, misshapen trees that hedged the lawn. Not a branch was straight, not one was free, but all were interlaced and grew one about another, and just above ground, where the cankered stems joined the protuberant roots, there were forms that imitated the human shape, and faces and twining limbs that amazed him. Green mosses were hair, and tresses were stark and grey lichen. A twisted root swelled into a limb. In the hollows of the rooted bark he saw the masks of men. As he gazed across the turf and into the thicket, the sunshine seemed really to become green, and the contrast between the bright glow poured on the lawn, and the black shadows of the brake made an odd flickering light in which all the grotesque postures of stem and root began to stir. The wood was alive. The turf beneath him heaved and sunk as with the deep swell of the sea. And he could have imagined a man who was able to live on one sense while he pleased, to whom, for example, every impression of touch, taste, hearing, or seeing should be translated into odor, who at the desired kiss should be ravished with the scent of dark violets, to whom music should be the perfume of a rose garden at dawn. This is not prose at all, but poetry, and poetry of a high order. And it is from such beautiful manipulation of words, phrases, and rhythms that Machen attains his most clairvoyant and arresting effects in the realms of horror, dread, and terror. From the strange gesturings of trees, the glow of furnace-like clouds, the somber beauty of brooding fields, and valleys all too still, the mystery of lovely women, and all the terror of life and nature seen with the understanding eye. So much for Arthur Machen as a novelist. It is a fascinating subject, but it is also an extensive one, and the curious, tenuous quality of his work may lead one into indiscretions. The peculiar philosophy of Arthur Machen is set down in hieroglyphics, and in Dr. Stiggins his views and principles. The first chapter of the latter work is a scathing satire on certain foibles and idiosyncrasies of the American people, such as lynching, vote-buying, and food adulteration, but as it is, on the whole, a polemical volume, which by the nature of the subjects it treats can have less permanent interest than the author's other work. It may be put to one side, although, as a specimen of Machen's impeccable prose, it must not be ignored. In hieroglyphics, he returns to those ecstasies mentioned in The White People, and gives us further definitions. The word ecstasy is merely a symbol. It has many synonyms. It means rapture, adoration, a withdrawal from common life, the other things. Who can furnish a precise definition of the indefinable? They, the other things, are sometimes in the song of a bird, sometimes in the whirl of a London street, sometimes hidden under a great, lonely hill. Some of us seek them with most hope and the fullest assurance in the sacring of the Mass. Others receive tidings through the sound of music, in the color of a picture, in the shining form of a statue, in the meditation of eternal truth. Hieroglyphics is Arthur Machen's theory of literature, brilliantly exposited by that cyclical mode of discoursing that was affected by Coleridge. In it he promulgates the admirable doctrine that fine literature must be, in effect, an allegory, and not the careful history of particular persons. He seeks a mark of division which is to separate fine literature from mere literature, and finds the solution in the one-word ecstasy, or, if you prefer, beauty, wonder, awe, mystery, sense of the unknown, desire for the unknown. With this conclusion, if ecstasy be present, then I say there is fine literature. If it be absent, then in spite of all cleverness, all the talents, all the workmanship and observation and dexterity you may show me, then I think we have a product, possibly a very interesting one, which is not fine literature. Following this reasoning, by an astonishing sequence of arguments, he proceeds to the bold experiment of proving Pickwick possessed of ecstasy, and Vanity Fair lacking it. The case is an extreme one, he admits, deliberately chosen to expound his theory to the nth degree. The analytical key to the test is found in the differentiation between art and artifice. A nice problem in such extreme instances as Poe's Dupin stories and Stevenson's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, as Mr. Machen points out. By this ingenious method the Odyssey, Oedipus, Morte d'Arthur, Kubla Khan, Don Quixote, and Rabelais immediately are proven fine literature, a host of other esteemed works merely, if you like, good literature. Pantagruel, by a more delicate application of the test, becomes a finer work than Don Quixote. And in the exposition of this dictum we come upon one of the mountain peaks of Machen's amazing philosophy. He begins the discussion with a jest about the enormous capacity for strong drink exhibited by Mr. Pickwick and his friends, and reminds us that it was the god of wine in whose honor Sophocles wrote his dramas and choral songs, who was worshipped and invoked at the Dionysiaca, and that all the drama arose from the celebration of the Bacchic mysteries. He goes on to the Gargantua and the Pantagruel, which reek of wine as Dickens does of brandy and water. The Rabelaisian history begins, Grand gousier estoit bon ralia en son temps, amant à boire net, and ends with the oracle of the holy bottle, with the word Change, un mot pendant fait, célébré et entendu de tout, nation, et nous signifie buvez. And I refer you, continues Machen, to the allocution of Bacchbook, the priestess of the bottle at large. By wine, she says, is man made divine. And I may say that if you have not got the key to these Rabelaisian riddles, much of the value, the highest value, of the book is lost to you. Seeking the meaning of this Bacchic cultus, this apparent glorification of drunkenness in all lands and in all times, from ancient Greece through Renaissance France to Victorian England, by peoples and persons not themselves given to excess, he finds it again in the word ecstasy. We are to conclude that both the ancient people and the modern writers recognized ecstasy as the supreme gift and state of man, and that they chose the vine and the juice of the vine as the most beautiful and significant symbol of that power which withdraws a man from the common life and the common consciousness, and taking him from the dust of earth, sets him in high places in the eternal world of ideas. Let us never forget that the essence of the book, Pantagruel, is in its splendid celebration of ecstasy under the figure of the vine. At this point, Mr. Machen places the key in our hands and declines further to reveal its secrets. In Mr. Pickwick's overdose of milk punch, we are to find ultimately a clue to the labyrinth of mystic theology. By his own test, we are enabled to place Arthur Machen's greatest works on the shelf with Don Quixote and Pantagruel. By his own test, we find the ecstasy of which he speaks in his own pages, under the symbol of the vine, and under figures even more beautiful and terrible. For minor consideration, he finds in Rabelais another symbolism of ecstasy. The shape of gauloiserie, of gross, exuberant gaiety, expressing itself by outrageous tales, outrageous words, by a very cataract of obscenity, if you please, if only you will notice how the obscenity of Rabelais transcends the obscenity of common life. His grossness is poured out in a sort of mad torrent, in a frenzy, a very passion of the unspeakable. In Cervantes he finds the greater deftness, the finer artifice, but he believes the conception of Rabelais the higher because it is the more remote. Pantagruel's more than frankness, its ebullition of grossness, is either the merest lunacy or else it is sublime. And the paragraph that succeeds this one in the book, perhaps, it is part of the same paragraph, sums up this astonishing philosophy with a conclusion calculated to shock the Puritanic, thus: "Don't you perceive that when a certain depth has been passed, you begin to ascend into the heights? The Persian poet expresses the most transcendental secrets of the divine love by the grossest phrases of the carnal love. So Rabelais soars above the common life, above the streets and the gutter, by going far lower than the streets and the gutter. He brings before you the highest by positing that which is lower than the lowest. And if you have the prepared, initiated mind, a Rabelaisian list is the best preface to the angelic song." All this may strike you as extreme paradox, but it has the disadvantage of being true, and perhaps you may assure yourself of its truth by recollecting the converse proposition, that it is when one is absorbed in the highest emotions that the most degrading images will intrude themselves. And so on. The sense of the futility almost of attempting to explain Machen becomes more pronounced as I progress. You will have to read him. You will find his books, if you are fortunate, in a murky corner of some obscure second-hand bookshop. Arthur Machen was born in Wales in 1863. He is married and has 2 children. That is an astonishing thought after reading The Inmost Light. It is surprising indeed to learn that he was born. He is High Church, with no particular respect for the Archbishop of Canterbury, and necessarily subconsciously Catholic, as must be all those lonely, awful souls who write ecstasy across the world. He hates Puritanism, with a sturdier hatred than inspires Chesterton. For a brilliant exposition of this aversion, I commend readers to his mocking introduction to the House of Souls. That work, The Hill of Dreams, and Hieroglyphics were written between 1890 and 1900, after which their author turned strolling player and alternated for a time between the smartest theatres in London and the shabbiest music halls in London's East End. For the last 6 years or so he has been a descriptive writer in the London Evening News. His works not before mentioned comprise a translation, the best, of the Heptameron, Fantastic Tales, a collection of medieval whimsies, partly translated and partly original, and altogether Rabelaisian and delightful. The Terror, a shilling shocker, his own characterization, but a finer work withal than most of the literature of the day, and The Great Return, an extraordinary short tale which may find place some day in another such collection as The House of Souls. I have mentioned the Chronicle of Clemendy, calling it a classic, and something further should be said about that astonishing book. It is the Welsh Heptameron, a chronicle of amorous intrigue, joyous drunkenness, and knightly endeavor second to none in the brief muster of the world's greatest classics. In it there is the veritable flavor of medieval record, somewhat less outspoken than Balzac in his droll stories, and less verbose than Boccaccio. Machen proves himself the peer of either in gay, irresponsible, diverting, unflagging invention, while his diction is lovelier than that of any of his forerunners, including the nameless authors of those rich Arabian tapestries, which were the parent tales of all medieval and modern facetiae. The day is coming when a number of serious charges will be laid against us who live in this generation, and some severe questions asked, and the fact that we will be dead, most of us, when the future fires its broadside, has nothing at all to do with the case. We are going to be asked post-mortem why we allowed Ambrose Bierce to vanish from our midst, unnoticed and unsought, after ignoring him shamefully throughout his career. Why Stephen Crane, after a few flamboyant reviews, was so quickly forgotten at death. Why Richard Middleton was permitted to swallow his poison at Brussels. Why W.C. Morrow and Walter Blackburn Hart were in our day known only to the initiated, discriminating few, their fine golden books merely rare items for the collector. Among other things, posterity is going to demand of us why, when the opportunity was ours, we did not open our hearts to Arthur Machen and name him among the very great. End of Section 1. Section 2 of Strange Roads and With the Gods in Spring by Arthur Machen. Section 2. The Remembrance of the Bard. In the darkness of old age, let not my memory fail. Let me not forget to celebrate the beloved land of Gwent. If they imprison me in a deep place, in a house of pestilence, Still shall I be free, remembering the sunshine upon Minneth mine. There have I listened to the song of the lark, my soul has ascended with the song of the little bird. The great white clouds were the ships of my spirit, sailing to the haven of the Almighty. Equally to be held in honor is the sight of the great mountain. Adorned with the gushing of many waters, sweet is the shade of its hazel thickets. There a treasure is preserved which I will not celebrate. It is glorious and deeply concealed. If Teals should return, if happiness were restored to the Comrie, Doyen de Frigg should serve his mass, then a great marvel would be made visible. O blessed and miraculous work! Then should my bliss be as the joy of angels. I had rather behold this offering than kiss the twin lips of dark Gwenllian. Dear my land of Gwent, O quam delecta tabernacula! Thy rivers are like precious golden streams of paradise. Thy hills are as the Mount Sion. Better a grave on Timbarlam than a throne in the palace of the Saxons at Caerlud. End of Section 2. Section 3 of Strange Roads and With the Gods in Spring by Arthur Machen. Section 3, The Praise of Mifanu. O gift of the everlasting, O wonderful and hidden mystery, many secrets have been vouchsafed to me. I have been long acquainted with the wisdom of the trees. Ash and oak and elm have communicated to me from my boyhood. The birch and the hazel and all the trees of the greenwood have not been dumb. There is a cauldron rimmed with pearls of whose gifts I am not ignorant. I will speak little of it. Its treasures are known to the bards. Many went on the search of Caer Pedrifon. 7 alone returned with Arthur, but my spirit was present. 7 are the apple trees in a beautiful orchard. I have eaten of their fruit, which is not bestowed on Saxons. I am not ignorant of a head which is glorious and venerable. It made perpetual entertainment for the warriors. Their joys would have been immortal. If they had not opened the door of the south, they would have feasted forever, listening to the song of the fairy birds of Rhiannon. Let not anyone instruct me concerning the glassy isle. In the garments of the saints who returned from it were rich odors of paradise. All this I knew, and yet my knowledge was ignorance. For one day as I walked by Caer Riu, in the principal forest of Gwent, I saw golden Mifanu as she bathed in the brook Tarogi. Her hair flowed about her. Arthur's crown had dissolved into a shining mist. I gazed into her blue eyes, as it were into twin heavens. All the parts of her body were adornments and miracles. O gift of the everlasting, O wonderful and hidden mystery, when I embraced Mifanu in a moment became immortality. End of Section 3. Section 4 of Strange Roads and With the Gods in Spring by Arthur Machen. Section 4, Strange Roads. The strangest road I know is also the shortest. Far in the west, a byway, thick and green with the ferns on its banks, and shadowed and cool with overhanging ash trees, diverges at a certain point, and offers the choice of right and left. The way to the right will take you to a castle that most of us are content to class amongst old things. It was built, this castle of Menorbier, when the Normans first came into Wales in the 12th century. It stands now a ruin, and yet a noble place, with its walls sloping outward as they come to the ground, battering, the builders call this device. It stands high on a sort of inland cliff or promontory, looking westward toward the bay, whose crimson bastions and bulwarks of old red sandstone are crowned with shimmering bracken and golden gorse and purple heather. A noble place, a noble aspect. Gerald Barry, called Geraldus Cambrensis, who was born in the castle, said that it was the fairest place that he had ever seen. But this is, after all, the new castle, although it is 7 centuries old. If you take the way to the left, you appear to go inland and away from the sea. A short lane brings you up to a high, wind-swept place, whence the blue sea is to be seen far away towards Tenby, but nowhere before you. And then you go down into a gentle valley, and here the road becomes a field track which ascends another hill and passes through the yard of a whitewashed farmhouse, gleaming in the sun. Here is a height once more, and still no hint of the sea. The track has become a path which goes under tall hedges of thorn by pasture and ploughed lands. And then, at a turn of the hedge, far away below, suddenly appear the blue fields of the sea. Foam-flecked, mingling in a haze in the distance with the blue sky and the shining air. But against the sky, and above the sea, there rises the fortifications of the old castle, a prehistoric stronghold. The ground falls from your feet steeply down a great slope of gorse and heather and bramble, and then swells up green to the sky. And on this seaward height rise these smooth, rounded, turfy circumvallations, as if one huge green billow were piled high above another, with a hollow place between them. I suppose it was a fort of refuge, a place where a certain number of the tribe could hold out for a while with their backs to a precipitous cliff and the sea. And if you climb the green billows of the outer walls, you come upon the road I mentioned, the short road. It seems to lead easily to the very heart of the fort, and I can imagine the hosts of the besiegers foaming up it, howling triumph, their rear guard pressing them on. An easy way, and then a sharp turn, and the short road rushes down swiftly to the sheer edge of the cliff, and to the hollow-sounding sea far below. Another strange road, I know, is by Marlborough. It leads up from the town to the high downs. For all I know, it was the road on which Tom Smart was driving when he had the adventure of the chair, which turned into a little old gentleman in the roadside inn. It was in the dusk of a summer evening, and the road presently became hedgeless, a white track on a wild, silent hill. The down fell away steeply on one side, and I noticed, as I went along, that little paths went twisting and winding down the turf, pausing by very ancient, low, twisted thorns, and then trickling and turning away towards the dimness of the valley. Somehow, I know not why, these queer winding paths by the old thorns made my companion and myself think of the people, that is, the fairies, and we turned back again towards Marlborough. And suddenly, quite instantly, without any preparation of a distant sound, soft at first, and growing louder by degrees, we both heard the sharp rattle of footfalls coming behind and gaining on us. We looked back, fully expecting to see the figure of someone in a great hurry and making pace, but no one was visible. And though the air was now growing dim, and the general aspect of the country indistinct, yet the road, white and chalky without the shadow of hedges, was quite clear before us. While we turned and stopped, the sound ceased, but when we went on, wondering a little, the clatter of hurrying steps was at once renewed and increased, as if the pursuit or the flight had grown sharper. It was not an echo. The road was soft with dust, and our own footfalls made no distinguishable sound. The noise that followed us was rather that of iron-shod feet beating on a track of granite. We were glad, I think, when we came to that part of the down which is just over Marlborough. Here some preparations for a fair were being made, tents were rising, and roundabouts were being jointed together, and red flares were burning. The rattle of pursuing footsteps ceased as we saw the glimmer of the lamps in the darkness of the little town below. I do not explain. I must simply suppose that we heard some noise which sounded like footsteps, but was not footsteps. That is all. I spoke of the strange little wandering downhill tracks by the thorns as suggesting to me, somehow or other, the thought of the fairy folk, so I think I should explain before I go on that I am not one of those happy people who have only to think of fairies to be hallucinated, whether visibly or audibly. I wish I were, for the actual roads of life are often or always gritty and punishing to tender feet, and it would be well and happy indeed if one could be rapt at the desire into the tender grass-grown ways of fairyland. And this reminds me, and again reminds me, but first of all, of a gentleman of an ancient Irish family that I once knew. Irish, I call him, for his ancestors had been settled in Ireland from remote times, but they were of Norman Welsh blood, and of the ruling caste, not of the peasantry. Well, this young fellow and I were talking literature together, and especially Mr. Yeats, and the new Irish literature, and I was expressing some bewilderment at the fact that men of character and of apparent good faith talked of seeing fairies in their daily walks. "Is it," I said, "some kind of symbolism, or what do they mean?" "What should they mean?" said young Mr. Geraldine, "but the truth. Can't you see the fairies when you want to? I've only to wish to see them, and I've often seen them sitting on the stone walls by the mountain roads in Galway. And then again, 6 years ago I was in Belfast. I was on a journalistic mission connected with the Ulster movement, which was perplexing and threatening in the September of 1913. I went with an open mind on the Irish question. On the one hand, I certainly had no sympathies with treason and disaffection, and I thought, and think still, that the Home Rule movement had been advanced by odious and cruel and criminal methods. On the other hand, as all my friends will testify, I am not an extreme Protestant, to put it mildly, or, as the rhetoricians would say, to use an agreeable meiosis, and I had a notion that I should find something extremely dour and harsh among the black Protestants of the northeast of Ireland. Well, I went mainly, or almost entirely, among the people who were on the orange side in politics, and I must say that I have never encountered a more cheery, kindly, or more hospitable folk. They could not do enough to show me the sights and the ways of Belfast, and they laughed at the bigotries and the furies of the less intelligent of their party. After I had looked round and about Belfast, I said I should like to see a little of the country, and one of these stern Orangemen immediately said he would take me out into the country in his car. We went some 12 miles out of the town, and when we were about halfway on our journey, there was something in the aspect of the country on either side of the road that impressed me strangely. I do not know how to put my impression into definite words, but somehow the wild hills that rose in the distance before us were of an outland form. The rocks that surged suddenly from the land to right and left suggested fortalices of a bygone people, and the very thorn trees that grew in the fields had about them an aspect of concealed mystery. Some devil of mischief moved me to ask my host, a leading Presbyterian and an eminent solicitor of Belfast, whether there were many fairy castles about that part of the country. I expected to be withered. I thought that McPhee Gillespie would advise me to talk to my friends the Catholics if I wanted to hear about drivelling superstitions. To my amazement, he replied in a matter-of-fact tone, in the tone that an Englishman would use if he were asked whether there were any country families of note in his neighborhood. "No, there are not many fairy raths about here. They're more Antrim way, but I can show you plenty of fairy thorns. There," he said, pointing to an old crooked thorn tree growing in the middle of a meadow, "that's a fairy thorn, and I can tell you that the farmer who rents that land, I know him well, he's a strong Presbyterian, would rather cut off his right hand than lay a finger on that tree." We passed through a dreary village, the ugly houses full on the street, without a sign of a garden or a flower anywhere. "It's uneasy here sometimes," said Mr. Gillespie. "You see, about half the people are Protestants, and the other half are Catholics. That's because we're getting higher. You see, the Ulster settlers took all the good land in the valleys and drove the Catholics away, and the higher you go, and the poorer the soil, the more Catholics you'll find." He was a fair man, but I had noticed that, though there were no gardens, nearly every house had a mountain ash planted by its door. I said, "You seem very fond of the mountain ash here." "Well," he replied, "the people think that they keep away the fairies. And as a matter of fact," he added, with a queer smile, "you'll see a good many mountain ash trees planted round my little place out here that I am taking you to." Then Mr. Gillespie began talking about flax, and the new and improved treatment of it, which had speeded up the linen manufacture tremendously. He was a thorough, practical man. But when we got to his country house, I found, as he said, that it was fended and hedged about by mountain ash trees. The saddest of all roads is the road that has been murdered. I know such a road in Wales. It wound to right and left in a goodly and leisurely fashion up a long, steep hill. The road was narrow and deep down in the ground. Every fern grew in splendor on those high banks. The wild strawberry was there, richly scarlet. The fretted leaves of the wild geranium were as if they had come from the margin of a golden, illuminated 13th-century missal. The arums showed purple rods in the spring and red berries in the autumn. Meadow-sweet flourished where wells of cold water trickled out of the limestone rock. And high overhead strange twisted wizened oaks mingled their leaves across the road. And so here, on the hottest day in summer, there was coolness and a pleasant green shade. The lane was narrow and steep, but it was well enough for the slow farm traffic, for the parson's trap and the doctor's gig. But a wealthy city man has a house and many motor cars in that part, and so one year I found that beautiful lane destroyed. All the oak trees had been cut down. The road had been straightened, as if it were the permanent way of a railway. The banks had been sliced on either side in the fashion of a railway cutting. They were bare. Flowers and ferns, and all the intermingled wonderful growth of ivy and honeysuckle and bryony had gone. The wells of cold water ran no more from the limestone rock. End of Section 4. Section 5 of Strange Roads and With the Gods in Spring by Arthur Machen. Section 5. With the Gods in Spring. We shall go on seeking it to the end, so long as there are men on the earth. We shall seek it in all manner of strange ways, some of them wise, and some of them unutterably foolish, but the search will never end. It is the secret of things, the real truth that is everywhere hidden under outward appearances, the end of the story, as it were, the few final words that make every doubtful page in the long book plain, that clear up all bewilderments and all perplexities, and show how there was profound meaning and purpose in passages apparently obscure and purposeless. These are the words which, once read, throw their light and radiance back over all the book. As the furnace fires blazing up suddenly at night in my own country in the west, shine far away among the woods, and in dark valleys, and discover his path to the wanderer in a wild, dim world. Doubtless there is a secret, an illuminating secret, hidden beneath all the surfaces of things, and perhaps the old alchemists were thinking of that secret when they spoke of the powder of projection, the philosopher's stone that turned all it touched into gold. There are many ways of the great quest of the secret. Some of them fill me with an immeasurable weariness. Not very long ago there was a picture in a daily paper with an odd history attached to it. The picture was a head of the Christ. It was a photograph of a painting done by a lady who was said to have no artistic skill whatever, but she had worked under spirit control and produced this marvel. The great spiritualist authorities said it was the finest head of the Christ that had ever been painted. Well, I looked at it and said, alas, within my soul. I am not a painter man myself, nor a critic of painter men, but if one has looked at certain of the masterworks with a humble heart, one has learnt a little, a very little, no doubt, but still something of the elements. The LCC schoolboy learns at quite an early age that dog is not spelt C-A-T, and nothing will move him from this secure faith. So I, with this newspaper photograph of Mrs. or Miss Somebody's head of the Christ, I could see that it was feeble, sentimental, sloppy, with about as much relation to painting or religion as the poems of the late Miss Frances Ridley Havergal have to literature or the faith. Painting men told me that, technically, the work was far from good, and I have no doubt that they were right. Well, a few days afterwards another photograph appeared in the newspaper. This also was of a painting of the head of the Christ. This had been painted by another lady, a Swede, I think, some years ago. Also, it was said, under spirit influence. It was obvious that picture number 1 had been suggested by picture number 2. And indeed, it was stated that the English spirit artist had had opportunities of seeing the work of the Swedish spirit artist. And then the English artist said that she had nothing to do with spirits. There it is. And it is no matter, as old Mr. Kimball, the actor, used to observe. But the secret is not to be found by that foolish way. It is long years ago, but I once saw a little glint of the secret, merely a flash of the great radiance, noted at the time, and adored yet forgotten in a moment, and yet never at all forgotten, but remembered still through all the heavy years that have gone by, and growing clearer, it seems, as the days darken and the shadows lengthen on the hill. A long while ago, 40 years ago, or near it, my 2 friends, Bill and Jack, and I set out for a walk early of an afternoon in March. We are all white-haired now. We have been grilled and roasted and boiled and fried in the fire of life. Then we were raw and merry, and I was the youngest and the rawest of the 3. But we were all in the mood of adventure. We would go to Usk, a little town in our country, far in the west, and go to it by a new way. Now one ascertains the surest bus route, or the quickest tubes, and sticks to the way when found. I should hate anyone who proposed to me the theory that it would be fun to get into the city from St. John's Wood by way of Clerkenwell or Pentonville. But we have come to the age of iron. So then Bill and Jack and I set out for Usk, and would find a new way of getting to that noble city of 2,000 souls or thereabouts. It was governed by a Portreeve in those days. I severed my connection with the Liberal Party when Lord Rosebery brought in a bill about unreformed corporations, and, like an evil enchanter, turned the Portreeve and bailiffs into a local government board. So we set out for Usk, and we took the high road that led to Pontypool under the mountains, not a bit like the road to Usk, and then left it by a lane which seemed likely to bear towards our desired end. Likely so to bear, but quite as likely not so to bear, for lanes twist and turn and bend in the land of Gwent. Still, we were going to Usk, and therefore, mark that therefore, rationalist, therefore, we knew that all lanes led to Usk, Bill and Jack and I. It was a great day of March. The wind shrilled and rustled and shivered, and shook all the dead woods. Though it was so keen and cold, it came, if I remember well, over the wall of the great and high mountain of the west, and drove the white and gray rolling clouds before it to eastward over the billows of the land. Over those hidden valleys where the little brooks rush clear and swift under the alders, over the hills where the pine trees stand, over the solemn hanging woods that were still and somber in their winter wear. We went along our lane laughing, because we knew, note that because, atheist, that it was most unlikely that we should ever get to Usk, and because we knew that we should most certainly get there. Presently the lane grew too probable. It seemed as if it were really leading us in the right direction. This was not to be endured, and so we chose the first stile that offered itself. I will say frankly that reason was not absolutely outraged. It was not infallibly certain that the path opening from the stile was more likely to lead to Constantinople than to Usk. Still, it seemed an improbable track, and so we took it gaily. I wish I could remember all that way. Ah, in these dim and late and dreary hours, if one could recollect the splendor of the dawn. But to be true, I remember very little, only the wonder, which is always a wonder, of passing through a new land and seeing things which are strange, and thereby receiving a revelation of the unknown. And this revelation you may get as surely in a country lane as if you went to the uttermost parts of the earth. But somewhere on this walk, as we talked of Moll and Meg, and strange experiences unfit for ladies, that glint and twinkling of the high supernal light came to me. We were skirting a wild little hill. It was a place of rough grass, winter withered, of bracken clumps turned brown, of brambles that had forgotten autumn berries, black and rich, of the twisted ancient thorn tree, dark and dreaming of fairyland, and as we passed on our way, while the keen wind shook the bare brown boughs as it went roaring down the valley to the brook, while the huge clouds rolled on to the sea, there I sat on the hillside, under a low black thorn bush rising from withered bracken, the green leaves and pale yellow blossoms of a daffodil shaking in that high cold wind. Verideus, it was forgotten as Bill and Jack and I came infallibly by our impossible way over the bridge into the Street of Usk, and to the Three Salmons, that inn of old and happy memory, forgotten then but remembered always, the shining apparition of the god. End of Section 5. End of Strange Roads and With the Gods in Spring by Arthur Machen.